Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast, Finding You. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy. I'm the Executive Clinical Director and the co-founder at Evoke Therapy Programs. So tonight's format, if you're new to this, is live question and answer. We have a couple of comments and a question left over from our last broadcast, and then we already have some live questions that are being submitted. So anytime you want to make a comment, ask a question, you can pass those on. Those will go to Amy, who's moderating for me this evening, and then she'll pass on those comments or questions in the order that she receives them. So I'm going to get right into the comments and questions. I will give one more bit of housekeeping information. If you are a sibling or you're under 18, let me know your age and relationship to the Evoke client. If you are a relative or a family friend, again, let me know your relationship. So give me some sense of who I'm talking to, who the audience is. The first slide is just a comment. Somebody wrote last time, I gave an example last time about consent. I think I said something along the lines of a lot of what we're learning about, for example, with consent today with women and girls is they can stop the act of sex at any point along. And I was making a comparison to parenting and kind of giving consent or not to people that were asking you questions or checking in with you about your struggle. And so somebody wrote, consent is not gendered. And I wanted to just say, I agree, and I apologize. I should have been more clear in my example. The second comment is somebody wrote, my son is coming home in 2 days, and admittedly, I am nervous. So thank you for the input and to not plan on him changing and work on ourselves. These one-liners help me and my husband tremendously. Thank you. So one piece of constructive and one piece of affirming feedback. Both are welcomed, of course. The first pre-submitted question we have, the only pre-submitted question we have before we get to any live questions, says this. My 15-year-old daughter has borderline traits. She threatens suicide frequently, but becomes instantly rational and calm when we go to call 911 for help. We put away the phone and the behavior starts again. It feels very manipulative. It becomes a game of cat and mouse. How do you set boundaries and consequences for such a serious issue? I won't go at length into explaining borderline traits or borderline personality disorder, but what this parent is describing here is an extraordinarily common dynamic and cycle when you're in a relationship with somebody that has borderline traits or borderline features. The best advice I've ever been given about borderline features, which I extrapolate to all relationships virtually, is the feedback that my mentor gave me from their experience in working in a psychiatric hospital where there was a group of borderlines and a borderline group that they ran, and kind of watching as everybody in on the unit ran circles. Of course, it's manipulative. Of course, that it gets reinforced by what we do. That's the idea of borderline. Let me give you a couple of nuggets here. The first nugget is the game in working with the borderline is you lose, end of game. That's the game. That's the whole game. You lose, end of game. The powerlessness, the frustration, right? The exhaustion, the exasperation at the cycle is in some sense them trying to put their stink on you, their smell on you, right? They want you to feel what they feel. So they act out in such a way to make you feel crazy, to make you feel powerless, hopeless, despairing, all of those things. So that can give some comfort when we realize that those are where the feelings are coming from. But the most direct advice around working with borderlines, like I said, that I use for everybody is the advice is you don't get to win, but you get to choose how to lose. And at some point, you know, when the stakes are life and death, it paralyzes every loved one. It would paralyze any parent of a child like the one that you're describing. So when you're ready, when you get to a point where you're ready to surrender and realize, I can't control this person. I can't control what they do, what they say, what they feel. So I'm going to lose the way that I want to lose. I'm going to take this step, set this boundary, draw this line in the sand, and then I'm going to accept the loss that comes. But I'm going to do it with integrity. I'm going to do it with my message. I had a similar experience with one of my children the other day after giving a consequence, a natural consequence, really, just to their behavior, the statement that they came back with a couple of days later was, you didn't realize the impact that this would have on my life, especially socially. And I didn't say anything to her. I let her be upset. She walked away, upset. And what I said to myself and what I said to my wife later when we were alone was, of course we considered it, but it didn't figure into the equation. When we decided to follow through on the consequence that was inherent in the behavior, right? Allow it to happen. When we followed through on that, we accepted any kind of consequence. In fact, we knew with this new boundary and this new consequence, it mostly just involved making sure that all the friends that were involved in this incident, all the parents knew. So it was just a very simple thing. We knew that we had no control over how other parents responded. So when she accused us of not considering, she was thinking that that's how we are making our decisions. And what that is that's feedback, right? She's really unconsciously connected to the fact that we have parented from a place of trying to control outcomes. So in that context, her accusation of us, her critique of our parenting made perfect sense. But in this particular instance, we were grounded. We did what we did because we felt like it was the right thing to do, and the outcome was beyond our control, and we were willing to accept whatever came of it. So you learn, you get to a point eventually with some relationships with people that struggle with mental illness or people that struggle with addiction. You get to the point eventually where you surrender, right? Where you let go of outcomes, where you realize that ultimately you're not in control, and you just step into your truth, step into your clarity, step into your groundedness. And then when the other person attempts to hold you hostage or blackmail you or threaten you by their response or by the collateral damage that they want to point out to you that you've created, your response is, you don't have to say it. I didn't say anything to my daughter. You just are okay with it. You just are okay with it. So that's what it looks like. All right. Let me do something here. Somebody writes this. Our older son is in the middle of a 90-day rehabilitation for opioids. When he gets out, he's going to need a place to stay, and I'm struggling mightily with allowing him back into our home after all the things that have transpired, including the influence of his younger brother, which led his younger brother to attend your wilderness program. The catch is that he wants his girlfriend to move in with him at our home. I see this as being a huge risk, but I also don't see many alternatives for him to remain sober if he doesn't have a place to live. I know you're going to suggest that I do my work, which I have been doing. I'm wondering if you have anything else that I'm not recognizing. My wife is leaning towards allowing him to stay with us. Great question. The way that I would respond to it, the way that I would respond to you is similar to the way I just responded to the borderline. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you can't control what he does or what he doesn't do. All you have control over is what you feel good about, what you feel comfortable with. And when I try to simplify what boundary setting looks like or sounds like, that's the way that I talk about it. That's the way I model it. This is what I'm okay with. This is what I'm willing to do. This is what I'm comfortable with. And then the other person gets to decide. Now what happens if we are bluffing, and we do bluff, and sometimes we're not even conscious of it. If we do bluff and they call our bluff, it'll be exposed, sometimes even to us, right? We'll realize that we're not really willing to follow through on that. So ideally, you do the work that you need to do to get comfortable with it. In general, with your son, who sounds like he's a young adult, home is generally not the best place for young adults who are struggling with mental illness and addiction. Ideally, some kind of sober living on their own. Those are again decisions that you need to make. right? So the healing, the work, and you knew that I was going to talk about this at some point. The work that we do is to heal and find ourselves. I'm just going to say that again because it's so fundamental. The work is finding ourselves. I talk about it this way. If we were encouraged to find ourselves and had a strong sense of ourselves, then we would eat when we were hungry. We would sleep when we are tired. We would go out when we wanted to go out, and we would stay in when we wanted to stay in. We would allow people to come over when we're okay with them coming over, and we wouldn't allow people to come over when we're not comfortable with it, or we're too tired, or we don't have the capacity or the energy right now. So really, it's about getting to know yourself, not being right, not believing that you have a silver bullet or a magic potion to change him, not believing that you can control all of those outcomes, and just putting it out there. The thing about it is there aren't a lot of choices, but that's not your problem. I mean, you can think about that and enter it in your consideration, but ultimately, for you parents of young adults, or maybe you're listening in relationship to partners or spouses or your siblings or your parents, the bottom line is he does have few choices, but that's not your problem. You know, if I wanted to come and live with you and you set parameters, like you're not comfortable with my wife coming with me and my children coming with me, I would take that into consideration. In other words, when you set the boundary, if you set the boundary, and I don't know what boundary you're going to choose, and I don't have any opinion about which it is, although I hear in your question a leaning towards, an inclination toward not having him come stay with you. But when you set your boundary with your son, you are just taking care of yourself. I don't think it's good for you in general. I don't think it's good for parents to have their young adult children live at home and recover at home, ideally, if they can. But what that translates to subsequently is I don't think it's good for him. So yeah, it's his challenge is not your problem. And if he has surrendered, if he's willing to do his work, and you set some parameters, the least of which is to not have his girlfriend come and live with you, he'll work with that. If he wants to be in control, if you set the boundary and he reacts poorly, let's just talk about that for a second. If you set the boundary in a relatively healthy way for relatively healthy reasons, and he reacts or threatens or punishes or guilts or throws a tantrum or gives up on himself, whatever it is, if he does one of those unhealthy things, then it completely underscores the necessity in the first place for the boundary. If he reacts well to it, then you have a little bit more of a dilemma, because then you can think, well, gosh, he's a little bit farther along than I thought. I wouldn't encourage you to capitulate immediately. Let that play itself out. But you know, the psychology at Evoke, the psychology of what we teach, what I teach, is really about learning to take care of yourself first, and then love other people as much as you are able. And if you go too quickly to number two, at the expense of number one, you need to revisit number one. So that's a lot of words and a lot of perspectives, and hopefully something in there helped you to think about your question, helped you to think about your issue. Amy, I guess you're going to have to post it and moderate it, and then check it yourself. Somebody writes this: something you said in the earlier webinar when you were talking about therapy made me curious. If I could find the courage to talk to my son and tell him that I started going to therapy thinking it would fix our relationship or help me support him in recovery, but I understand now that it is not because of him, that he was never the problem, it was me. What would that do for him? Would it really make a difference? It's part of a formula that that can and does make a difference. Overall, I like the idea. It's honest. It accomplishes that. It also accomplishes the shift that you are making. It underscores that most likely in your relationship, you have been unconsciously asking him to take care of you. And what that means is, you're asking him. You have to cut and paste it, Amy. So let me just try to delete that if you can. That one, if you can. Uh, but you're trying to you're trying to, in this experience, let him know that you're it's kind of like an apology. I'm aware. My mother said to me about 6 or 7 years ago on a drive to the airport, she said, "You were too big for me growing up, and I didn't know what to do with you, and I'm sorry. I was outmatched by you and the way that you think and the way that you are, and your troubles." I wasn't waiting and holding out hope that I would eventually get that acknowledgement and that amends, that apology, but it was nice. In a vacuum, um, it doesn't do anything. In a vacuum, it does nothing if you haven't changed your behavior. But as a part of a larger shift, a larger equation, to let your child know that you're shifting from him being the identified patient to you working on yourself is a great unburdening. It's a huge unburdening for him, taking the responsibility off of his shoulders. And in part, what so many people are medicating with their medicators is the stress and the pressure and the voice in their head that says that they have to take care of other people, that it's not safe to be who they are, that if they live or express their truth, which sometimes includes quite a bit of struggle and detours and messiness, that it will be overwhelming for the people around them, and there's a tremendous amount of guilt on that type of person. So what takes that away? Self-medicating behaviors. It quiets that codependent voice. It quiets that belief that what somebody else feels is my responsibility. I can say this safely because my mother doesn't listen to the podcast, but I'm going to therapy with her therapist in the next week or so to share with her a hard truth, a boundary in our lives around her visits. And I'm doing it with a therapist at the encouragement of my family to give her support, to give the therapist some insight and some tools to give her support, because I need this for me and my family, my immediate family, and I don't want to have to take care of her. So I'll hand that off to the therapist. I'll hand that off to somebody else. And at least what we do is we hand it off to the individual that we're talking about, and then they have to go solve that issue. They have to go deal with that. All right, let's see what we got. My 14-year-old son is in wilderness therapy in Utah. The original plan was to go to a residential treatment center, but I miss him too much. I feel guilty that because I am deficit as a mother, that he has to pay the price and go to an RTC for 12 months. I'm struggling to finalize the IEP paperwork for the RTC placement because I'm not sure that this is the right decision, and because I don't want him to be away from home for that long. Plus, my son is very bonded to his dog, and I want him to see his dog. Residential treatment is a 12-hour drive and not very practical for me as a single mother to drive to the residential center with the dog and to visit with the dog. I know it's hurting my son to be away from his dog. Any suggestions on how to go through this decision-making process? The interesting part of it was when you first started saying that you were feeling guilty. I thought you were feeling guilty for wanting him to come home, that you might take him home, and that's where the guilt was coming from. But your guilt is that he's going to be away, and you see that connection as he's paying for your mistakes by being in residential treatment. Here's the thing, guys. The thing is this. Um, I've said this before, but I'll work it out a little bit more. We can't not dent our children. That's impossible. Probably the biggest, most comprehensive mistake that parents make is the belief that they can be good. I know there's a phrase called good enough, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight. But the idea that a parent, the fantasy that a parent has that they can be good, that they even aspire to be good. In psychological terms, our aspiration is to be whole, to be all of us. When we realize that that's the goal, when we strive toward that, then we're able to do our work, to work on our stuff, to heal our wounds, to deal with our own trauma. So you can't not dent your children. All of you will. You'll dent him if you come home, if he comes home, and you'll dent him if you send him away. And there's no perfect equation that I can give you, that anybody can give you, that guarantees that you're not going to hurt him. So you just have to prioritize. And the thing about denting children, and it applies to us as children, because all of us are children of parents also. Yes, I'm the one who dented my children. I'm one of the ones who dented my children. But now the dent is theirs to work out. And when a child is in a wilderness program or at a residential treatment center, they have people to help them work it out. I say this all the time. For most of our clients and students, those in the program, the worst things in life haven't happened yet. I wish, in most cases, that were true, that the worst was behind these young people that we serve, that we treat. But for most of them, just speaking realistically, the most painful and difficult things haven't happened to them. There's a quote by by Alice Miller in the most, as I say all the time, the most important book on parenting that I've ever read, ever been introduced to, The Drama That Gets a Child. And she says, a parent, she actually says mother, because back in 1979, it was always about mothers, but a parent, even if they are not able to provide their child with what the child needs, a parent that is not especially nurturing, she says, can still give it to the child if they only allow that child to get it from somebody else. So I want to be clear as I can be, because you guys ask me so many questions about how to make a decision. And I will say it this way, and I don't think I've quite said it this way before. Both options are valid. Both options are valid. There's neither one of them will prevent pain and difficulty. And both come with, to some extent, your own wounding and trauma involved in it. The goal for me, as a self-help podcaster, as a therapist, as the clinical director of our program, is not to tell you which one to choose, but to encourage you to tap into what's most important. If you're acting out a wound by having your child come home, let's challenge that. If you're acting out a wound by sending your child away, i.e., you're trying to punish them, you can never forgive them, right? You want them to feel bad. If you're acting out in that way, then let's challenge that thinking. So what I hear in your question is some anxiety. I hear some trauma. And I hear you asking a really important question, but the deeper question is, what goes into your thinking process? You could bring him home, and that could be worse off for him. I've talked about this many times. I have 4 children, 28, 26, 19, and 13. And sometimes the best place for them is not with me at the moment. It can be as small and trivial as, don't hang out at baseball practice or softball practice with your kids and the coach. Let them figure it out on themselves. Let them work it out themselves, right? At the same time, I've got to figure out, am I bringing him home for my need? Because I can't stand the empathic suffering, or I need him, I need his attention, or I need him to think that I'm a good parent or a good mother, or I need him to think I haven't abandoned him, right? Those are all for you. Those have nothing to do with his needs. Parents will sometimes say to me, what if my child abandons me? And what I say practically is, it doesn't work that way. Children can't abandon parents. It's a word that isn't reserved for that relationship, right? We can abandon them, but they can't abandon us. The goal is for us to get them to the point where they go out and live their life, and we let them go as far away and as long as they want to. And if we do that, you know what happens? They keep coming back. Because why wouldn't you? If you're allowed as a human being, think about this. If you're allowed as a human being to take care of yourself in the relationship with your mother or your father, or it could be anybody, if you're allowed and encouraged and reinforced to take care of yourself and your needs, why wouldn't you want to be around that person? That's the easiest place in the world to be. It's the same in a marriage. If you're allowed to take care of yourself, if your needs matter, and taking care of them by going away even is supported. You know, if my children, I've said this before, if my children said, Dad, I need to get away from you after they're 18, because being around you is toxic, 10 out of 10 times I would support them in going away, but they don't need to, because it's okay for them to feel that way. I don't need them to be a certain way. So those are just stories. Those are just ideas to help you kind of sort through this process. Do your work, understand what your needs and your trauma is separate from your child. Understand if the decision is coming from your need or from his need. Get clear on that, and then make the decision from that place. And which decision you make doesn't matter to me. That's not my job. That's not any therapist's job, actually. Our job is to help you heal your attachment wounds or heal your codependency, and then you will make the decision that's best for you and your family. So thank you. Somebody writes, our 14-year-old son graduated Evoke and now is at a therapeutic boarding school. Can you speak to ideas on how to help an emotionally dysregulated teen who is not thinking rationally in the moment? We have found that we actually have to remove ourselves from the home. We would prefer to stay at home. I understand the preference to want to stay at home. You know, I've said this a lot, but I'll repeat it. You know, children are hard. Children that are healthy are hard at times. Children struggling with mental health issues or addiction are extra difficult, right? They require more of our resources, more of our problem solving, more of our energy. So we have to go somewhere and get that support. That's why we encourage you to go to Al-Anon and do your own therapy, so that you're taking care of yourself over there, right? You take care of yourself over there. So when you come back to the child, the interaction serves to support the child, because you've already taken care of yourself. You don't need anything else from the child. And if you do need something, then it comes in the form of a boundary. So the most common answer would be work on your own regulation, right? What if you had a chronically ill, I mean, God forbid, what if you had a child that had cancer, right? What if you had a child that was in a terrible car accident? I'm not meaning to exaggerate the situation, but it's the same kind of question, which is, these things are outside of your control. If your child has cancer, you can do all that you can do, but ultimately, it's out of your control. Or if a child gets in a car accident, that's already happened. There's nothing you could do about the car accident. All you can do is kind of cope with and deal with what's presenting itself to you. So do your work, find your resources, find other sources of support. Don't go to your child who's struggling with mental illness for support from them. And then learn to set boundaries. learn to set them in the context of this is what I'm okay with and this is what I'm not. But I have all the empathy for you in the world because some children are capable of finding the edge of our limits every day. Somebody writes, my son, an Evoke graduate, took time off from college as he was depressed. He was going to get a job. He didn't get a job after putting out maybe 6 applications. He had a psychiatrist and was started on medication but stopped. He keeps making appointments with therapists but cancels them. He just had a remote visit with a therapist but didn't like the therapist. He feels he is doing better now in exercising, decreasing his drinking, which was substantial, finishing the incomplete courses, reading and getting ready to restart school in August. We are paying for his apartment and all his living expenses in a state halfway across the country. He keeps saying I am bringing him down and feels that I should be more supportive and more congratulatory, but I tell him I want him to be ready when he goes back to school. I stopped therapy with the pandemic and realized as I write this, I need to go back. Please chime in and help. I'm glad that just writing the question kind of brought something up for you. What I would say with this situation is, generally speaking, I discourage parents focusing on the means to the end for their child, right? Like it's not up to you to decide if your child is an alcoholic, but you can set boundaries around alcohol. It's not your job to set boundaries about whether or not your child has a mental illness. Your adult child has a mental illness, but it is your job to set boundaries around how they treat you in your house and your property and any kind of financial support. And the goal is to break away from him, right? If I were talking to him, I would say to your son, work your butt off so you don't have to rely on your parents so they're not up in your business. I'll say that again. If I were talking to your son, I would say, work, problem solve, work your tail off so you can support yourself as soon as possible so your parents aren't up in your business. Because that's the ideal, right? We want him to function independently. And it's unfortunate for both of you that you find the necessity and he finds the necessity to support him. You're allowed to ask questions and set boundaries around that support. But generally, my encouragement is don't manage the process, but manage the outcomes. It's not your job to figure out how he's getting to from point A to point B. Your boundary is around point B. So if he needs to be sober and not use drugs, great. If harm reduction works for him, fantastic. If becoming a Buddhist works for him, wonderful. If smart recovery works for him, fantastic. If he discovers that he can use socially, wonderful. None of my business. I don't care how you got there. My boundary is this is the way I'm supporting. This is what I expect. Here are the parameters of my support around that. And I'm not going to manage the how-to. I don't care how many applications you put out. If my expectation is a job, then it's a job. If my expectation is to put out 10 applications, then I care about how many applications you put out. So it's a shift in relationship insensibilities with your son. And I think this is difficult for parents because they hear me saying, don't set boundaries or be a pushover. But the fact of the matter is, it's none of your business whether or not your child is an alcoholic. And I'm not speaking to your specific circumstances when I say that. I'm talking as the principal. It's none of your business, psychologically, spiritually speaking. It's not your business whether your ex-husband is a narcissist. It's not your business whether your ex-wife has borderline personality disorder. Those aren't your business in terms of your own mental health. What is your business is how it shows up in your life. So if I say to my wife who's abusing alcohol, using alcohol, if I say, what it sounds like is if I finally have had enough, I go to her and I say this, you know what? I can't have alcohol in my life anymore. I can't have it in our home. It's wreaking havoc for all of us. You, my wife, can keep drinking as long as you want. And I'm not going to try to stop you. And I'm not setting this boundary to try to get you to stop. I've been spending the last 20 years in our marriage to try to get you to stop, and I'm done trying to control you. But here's my boundary. I'm leaving, or I'm going on a retreat, or I'm going to live at my brother's house, or whatever it is. I'm filing for divorce, right? Whatever the decision is. But it's not about getting them to stop drinking. It's about your boundary. And I'm going to tell you something magical about that shift. It's magic. It changes everything. First and foremost, you take control of your serenity. You guys, until we realize that we're responsible for our unhappiness, we'll never get better as parents or spouses or friends or siblings or children. Until we accept that my approach to life is what's causing my unhappiness, I'll never get better. Until I accept that I can't regulate my happiness, my serenity, my peace of mind by regulating something outside of me. Until I realize that, I'll never get better. Until I realize that to manage my own anxiety and fear, which is right, which is in codependency pervasive. Until I realize the craziness, the futility of trying to control you and your addictions and your mental health as a pathway to me feeling better on a daily basis, until I accept that, I'll never get better. Until I realize the problem and the solution are in here, I will never get better. But here's the magic, and you got to be careful when you say this. You got to be careful when you hear this. When I make that shift, it's kind of like being a Jedi, being Obi-Wan Kenobi. The Star Wars myth, the story, and the philosophy behind it was based on Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, what I talk about in my first and my second book, partly what Evoke is founded on, right? And so when you realize that in here, I'm pointing to the temples on each side of my head, until you realize that in here is where all the problems and all the devils and all the solutions are, I will never get better. And I will continually try to do something to get something that I can never get from it. So codependency is what Melanie Klein, the great psychologist, would teach, what she taught. When we shift our perspective from the paranoid state, which is an early state in life, which is the problem is out there, to what she calls the depressed state or stage, which is the problem is in here, inside of me. Until we make that transition, we'll never get better. We won't be in recovery. And I am not saying that when the people that we love, especially our children, hurt, that we don't hurt. You can't avoid hurt unless you just want to take morphine or heroin or opioids until you die. That's the only way to avoid pain, right? Medicate yourself until you die. But living a whole life isn't avoiding pain or sadness or grief or loss. It's not being held hostage by it. It's not putting all of your eggs in a basket. That's why it's so important to live your own life. That's why it's so important to be unavailable to your child because you're at an Al-Anon meeting or at a therapy session for you. Or you get a job where you can't pick up after them, right? You talk about it in terms of, if I'm living my life, then I can be there for my children. And unless you think I'm talking about something that is not love, that's what it means to love. It means I'm taken care of. So my interactions with you are to support you. That's the expression of love. In my book, I quote Will Smith, right? Will and Jada Pinkett Smith have talked about their marriage since this quote was given. They talked about it quite a bit. But Will Smith says in the chapter on marriage in The Audacity to Be You, the quote that I say is he finally came to the point with he and Jada where he said to her, I want you to go and get happy. I want to see if it's even possible for you to be happy. And they both decided that they're not going to come to each other with their empty cups begging for the other person to fill it, but they're going to go get happy and then come to the marriage happy. And we don't think that way. And our stupid, ridiculous sitcom or romantic comedies and romantic novels tell us that it's our job to make our spouse happy. You can't. You can try. Lord knows I have tried. And it nearly killed us, right? It nearly destroyed both of us and our marriage. So this applies to every relationship. Your job is to go and get happy and then come to the relationship happy. Again, it doesn't mean there's not sacrifice and compromise because that is a necessity in relationship. It just means that there's balance, that you're not giving up essential aspects of yourself, right? You're not disavowing part of you, part of your values that are core to who you are, to fit in or find belonging. You're not extending yourself beyond your ability to maintain your serenity. So this is the work. We accept in our program, we accept the children that come to our program because we know that they're struggling with mental illness and addiction. And that's your ticket for entry into this process. Most of you that listen to this aren't even parents of our program anyway. But the fact of the matter is, once they're here, once we're taking care of them, now it's the time for you to go out and figure out how to be happy, independent of your child. That is the greatest gift that you can give to your child. To be happy and then come to the relationship happy. And happy's too simple, but you know what I mean. Have a peace of mind. Have your own serenity. In Al-Anon, you learn my serenity is my responsibility. And the way that I practice my serenity is often through boundaries. So thank you. Next question. After finishing Evoke, my child is in a residential aftercare program. He is doing well and likes the program. 24-hour structure seems to be important. When a child leaves residential, how do you sort out the level of type of structure to try to replicate it in the world? First and foremost, to understand that regression and relapse is a part of recovery. So don't get too attached to perfection. What I talk about is, Evoke therapy programs is a small box, right? It's a very small box. And interestingly and ironically for a lot of people, in some ways, it'll be the easiest place that your child will ever be in their entire life. They won't recognize it until later, right? But you have all kinds of support. Therapy can happen at any moment. A group session virtually can happen any time of day. So you have support. But eventually that box has to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So take your best guess. Consult with a sponsor or with a professional that you trust to get some ideas, to get your thinking right, if you will, to make sure you're thinking and considering everything, and then take your best shot, and then turn over the success to your child. Turn over the success to your child in such a way that when he says, this third placement was too rigid and too supervised, therefore you screwed me up, or this was too big of a step down and I didn't have the structure I needed, so I screwed up. When he accuses you of one or the other, and it doesn't matter which, for the sake of this exercise, assume he's going to accuse you of both. Your response is, I'm sorry. I wish I had known. I did the best with what I had, but I hear from you that it didn't work, and I'm really sorry. I hope you can figure that out. right? And literally, you don't say these words. I don't talk like this so that you'll repeat it. And I definitely don't want you to write it down and repeat 95% of what I teach you, right? None of this is for your partner. None of this is for your mother or your father. None of this is for your child. This is for you. But having said that, what I'm saying is there's a sensibility that it's not up to you. You'll do the best you can. Hopefully you'll have good professionals that you're working with that you trust to carry you through a process to come to your own decision. But at the end of the day, you're turning it over to your child. If you have a higher power, if you're in recovery and you have a higher power, turn it over to your higher power. I love the slogan that is sometimes used in the 12-step programs that says this: the difference between me and God is God never thinks that he's me, right? Us codependents, because we grew up in a traumatized home that felt so out of control and we had to learn to manage and be hypervigilant, us codependents continue to operate from a sense of control. And we're successful. We're successful at work. We're successful in a lot of spheres in life. And then we have these children that come along and expose the flaw, the spiritual mistake in the thinking that goes into it, right? They're here to show us that we're not in control of anything but ourselves. That's their gift to us. And we'd rather learn it a different way. But we tend to, like our children, we tend to learn things the hardest ways. Somebody writes, my son just got back home from a long-term program after Evoke. I'm happy and I am doing my work. Thank you for your teaching. You know, oh, it continues. We have two issues. He doesn't do the chores around the house. I don't know if this is related to the top one. I think it's a different question. I'll just start it off. We have two issues. He doesn't do the chores around the house he's supposed to do, and he has a lot of free time he could use to find another job to pay the car back. But he doesn't look for it. He's 18. Suggestions. Thank you so much. I read something today on social media. There's this account that I like to follow called The Mindful Gentle Mama. If you follow me, drbradreedy.com, you'll see her account. And I love this thing that she says. If you've told a child 1,000 times and he still doesn't understand, then it is not the child who is the slow learner. If you've told a child something 1,000 times and he still does not understand, then it is not the child who is a slow learner. So, these lessons are for us, and with your son, you got to figure out where your boundaries are. You got to figure out and prioritize. We don't want a nuclear option with every misstep, right? We don't want to have to follow through on a nuclear launch because somebody relapsed once, right? That would be silly of us, because we all relapse. You relapse, I relapse. And we don't want to ignore our boundaries. There's a question that gets presented to me all the time when I teach about this idea of self. People say, well, how much is too far? When are you being a doormat? When are you not asserting and advocating for your own needs? Or because you're compromising too much? Or when are you being too rigid, right? Too selfish, too self-centered, too unyielding, right? Those are the two questions for all of us, for all of you. A doormat or unyielding and rigid? And the answer is, this might bother you a little bit. The answer is, that's the right question. That is your work. To figure out your answer and what feels right to you. And I and everybody else on planet Earth may have their opinions that you're being too selfish or too generous. And guess what? Doesn't matter. Not their purview. Not their side of the street. See, that's the job. My job as a human being, and most of what I share with you is from my experience of being a human being, not being a therapist. I just happen to have some training that helps me put it in context and in language that makes sense, but my job is to figure that out too. I used to say when I was younger as a therapist, the way that I talked about this back then is the most important question to ask somebody is, what do you want? I used to say that to kids all the time. What do you want? Well, I want to go home. And I say, okay, let me help you get home as soon as possible. I have some ideas about how to make that happen. So we can start, right? The question of what do you want? If you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting, if you haven't seen it, then watch it. You've been missing out. But in the movie Good Will Hunting, when the therapist, played by Robin Williams, asks the client, played by Matt Damon, the question in this critical session, he basically says, you're in all of your BS, but what do you want? What do you want? And this sarcastic, charming, nearly sociopathic kid, played by Matt Damon, had no answers. So the task, the work, is for you to become you. Unless you think that that's going to end up in you being a selfish, hedonistic, insensitive, unempathic person, you couldn't be farther from the truth. It is, in my opinion, the only way to be able to express love. Because everything else, if you live a life trying to be good, then all your decisions are made to serve your ego, not out of love. I hope that helps. Well, I'm going to wrap up for this evening. Thanks for joining us. Let's go to upcoming things. Both of my books, The Journey of the Rogue Parent, is available on Amazon, as is The Audacity to Be You. And I did the audio for The Audacity to Be You, so you can pick that up on Amazon or Audible. I know a lot of people don't like Amazon right now, and I get it, but for us small booksellers, it's really our only option. We have support groups for wilderness current families and alumni families. The next one will be tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And we also have support groups once a month for our intensive alumni. The next one is June 13th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Just email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information or to register. malia@evoketherapy.com. MALIA@evoketherapy.com. If you want to do a deep dive into your work, I don't think that there's a better way to spend your time and your money. I do it myself. My family does it. Everybody that in my life, I talk about this with everybody. Do your own work by going into an intensive. I think we might have filled the July one, but contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. You'll end up talking to my daughter, the wonderful and talented and smart Emma Reedy, to talk about what's right for you. We have them online and in person, depending upon your budget and your time that you can spend. We are doing a Returning to You, which is, we used to call it Finding You Too, a Returning to You. So if you've been to a Finding You in person, Returning to You is the next program. October 6th through 10th is when it's happening. So sign up in advance for that. We have coaching. If you want coaching or therapy from an Evoke therapist who follows our model, you can contact Travis@evoketherapy.com. It's kind of like therapy, but it's done virtually across state lines, so we call it coaching. We also have adventure trips for families and young adults. Our Pursuits program, it can be in between programs, after programs, sober fun, a reconnection to the work. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. It's free, and not much is free. So Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or Adult Children are great places to go. They're happening online as well as in person these days. RefugeRecovery.org is a great group that can also provide support. Less of an emphasis on a higher power, a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. And then the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI.org, is a great place to get local resources for free in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast. Follow us. Each new episode will be announced on your smartphone. So go to any podcast app and search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast. Or you can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or on Instagram using @EvokeTherapy Intensives. You can find either one of our programs on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, the blog also has new content each week. For upcoming new webinars, broadcast. I'm going to do one on Monday, the 14th, this coming Monday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about psychodrama. So for those of you who are interested in the possibility of our intensive program, this will be a time to tune in. And then after that, on Wednesday, the 16th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, I have another question and answer. We go every other time, topic, and then Q&A. Thank you for joining us. I hope this is helpful, a helpful point of contact. And on behalf of the people that love you and that care about you in your life, or if you happen to support people professionally, for all of those people, thank you for tuning in and being willing to do your work, for being willing to take the heroic journey, because no matter what the details of the story are, no matter the story, the heroic journey is always inward. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you on Monday night. Bye-bye. Take care.